what is money?
Oh, as you know, that's my favorite question.
For politicians, money is power. They always crave more. But because they don't actually produce anything, they've got limited ways to get it.
What's the end purpose of the devaluation of money?
The core to the answer of what it is an understanding of what a cartel is.
Throughout history, this has proven to be the most sought-after monopolistic power of man.
It is the main weapon used by the United States to preserve its power across the world.
They'll accuse the U.S. government of making money out of thin air. Maybe we do, but we're the U.S. government.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
We have to talk about it because the American people think the reason for inflation is government spending more money. Simply not true.
Well, so if the government can print the limited amounts of money out of thin air, why did they collect taxes?
Voters don't like paying higher taxes. They resent it. So over time, most politicians decide it's a lot easier to devalue the currency. You keep the tax rate pretty much the same, you just print more money.
So we believe we live in a democracy. We believe we have rule of law, but money is superordinate to rule of law.
The Federal Reserve, all the central banks of the world have been in a grand money printing experiment, which is basically destroying savers around the world.
And what we need today in the United States of America more than anything is the separation of money and the state.
My fear is that we've gone past this representative republic that we're supposed to be and into this thing that's controlled by money. And the only person that talks about stopping it is Trump, but even he is, people are skeptical about his connections to money.
But isn't the next logical step for you to embrace Bitcoin? Because Bitcoin obviously is decentralized. The government can't get its hands on it.
I can live with it one way or the other. I've always liked one really powerful thing, and that's called the dollar.
Robert asked me on his show, what is money?
What does that mean?
It is the question of our time, Charles.
They're not trying to just change the economy. They're trying to redefine what money is.
But politicians have found it a nuisance to pay their bills using money with integrity.
In the game of money, if you're unaware of how it is being played, then in all likelihood, you are the game being played.
Like, what is money?
Money is economic energy.
Money is a promise, so it's based on trust.
It's a great business to be in, central banking. Print money and people believe it.
One of the greatest thieves in the history of mankind is the central bank.
That's what the Federal Reserve is, a cartel and a partnership between the bankers and the politicians.
We have a monetary system built on theft and deception. It's used to fund warfare.
But it's an ominous power. There is no other power greater than the power over money.
When there's a financial problem, when the granaries are empty, they print money.
Which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time. And yet governments and central banks do it all the time.
When money ceases to be the tool by which men deal with one another, then men become the tools of men.
The situation is even worse than it seems, because if most Americans and the rest of the world were to become aware of this farce, confidence in your currency would be lost, the dollar would fall, and the Western civilization with it.
Okay, so we thought that would be a apt intro to our conversation today.
Very powerful.
That was a synthesis that my creative guy and I put together. For many months, I was retweeting little video clips saying that the question, what is money, will be historically regarded as the defining question of our time in history. And we compiled all those clips into that little video. And I think this is a very nice setup for what we're going to talk about here today, which are, I guess I could summarily say, is the parallels between the panic of 1907 and the great financial crisis of 2007. And so this is a nice document that you prepared for this conversation today. You always come very prepared. Thank you, sir. I will read the thesis and then we will get this thing rolling. The battle for freedom and liberty that is the embodiment of the United States has had multiple periods of purposeful wealth transfer and confiscation, the primary being the Panic of 1907. Both wars of 1776 and 1812 were wars against the central banks, and with Andrew Jackson's successful curtailment of another central bank officially called the Second Bank of the United States by vetoing a bill to recharter it after a brief credit contraction in 1837, commonly referred to as the Bank War. The central banksters did not reemerge in force until 1907. Further, does our Constitution grant Congress the authority to create a central bank in the first place? The Panic of 1907 is extremely important as it was created and utilized to usher in the Aldrich Plan, which is the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So that has a lot of, let's say, jargon and specific events in it. A lot of people that watch the show are probably familiar with many of these things, but how do we, this is such an important, it's like the most important thing in the world, as hopefully the video is making the point, and hopefully this conversation will help people to understand. How do we start to demystify the game that is actually being played here so that people can understand how not to be played?
You know, it's a great question. And I'm super honored and humbled to be doing this with you. I think relitigating, rehashing, and giving rebirth to the evidence that we have as American citizens of our own history, and as Mark Twain said, history rhymes, it doesn't repeat itself, will very much help people deal with, frame, and really kind of take in what's going on now and what the plan is for Agenda 2030, for example, right? And so I read all of this history as an 18 and 19-year-old, and then reread it as an adult, and had two different outcomes, right? Because when you're first reading it, or when I was maybe 19 or 20 reading it, I'm like, oh, just memorizing dates, understanding who said what, who was the secondary evidence of the time to substantiate the first witnesses, regurgitation of the words that were spoken at the time. I've always been a skeptic and contrarian, so never trusted only firsthand accounts, right? You want multiple pieces of evidence. But reading it as an adult, you understand this has been a centuries-long plan, executed one component at a time, and that each quote-unquote panic or pandemic or travesty, war, right, has been utilized for specific means and methods to remove property rights, confiscate wealth, and transfer assets and wealth directly. And why the Panic of 1907 is so important is because it was utilized to essentially fearmonger politicians into backing the Aldrich plan, which you would argue is the third bank of the United States. Now, this one's private, right? Before the previous iterations, Treasury owned 20% of the first bank of the United States and the second bank. And it's really to understand why they wanted this power so bad, is to analyze this period.
The most sought after monopolistic power in the history of man, I think, is what Ron Paul said.
I mean, that just gives me chills hearing you say it. And obviously I've heard Ron, the good doctor, say it many times. And I think it really frames, that we only have property rights in Bitcoin and physical gold.
Yeah.
And that's one of our only ways to express ourselves, within our own rule of law for our families.
Yeah.
And then B, we have to understand law. We have to understand banking. We have to understand asset forfeiture, eminent domain. We have to understand all of this. Like this is timely because we're seeing the eminent domain and asset forfeiture all over North Carolina. It's attempting to occur on the Florida West Coast now. And without our full understanding and command of the subject matter of the last few hundred years of American history, which in our entire existence has been fighting this force, then we're just going to go the way of Rome, the way of Babylon, and the West is lost. So it has very big significance to right now.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.